Thanks everyone for coming today. Welcome to our talk with Professor Bartholomew or Bat Sparrow of UT Austin, where he works in the Department of Government. My name is Joe Steeb. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at Mershon. I work with the U.S. Foreign and Military Policy Research Cluster. Dr. Sparrow is the author of several books, most recent of which is the excellent 2015 book, The Strategist, which I have right here. Brent Scowcroft and the Call of National Security. His talk today is entitled The Legacy and Strategic Thought of Brent Scowcroft, who served in numerous government positions, most notably George H.W. Bush's National Security Advisor. General Scowcroft died in August of this year, which makes it an important time to consider his historical impact. Dr. Sparrow is going to do a little introductory talk, and then we'll just open the floor up to questions and discussions. I think because we have a relatively small group, we can have people just kind of jump in with the questions and comments that they want to make. So with that being said, let me turn things over to Dr. Sparrow.
Well, thanks, Joe, and thanks, Kyle, and thanks for you guys who are attending, and I look forward to your questions. One of Scowcroft's favorite jokes was, a friend in Washington is someone who stabs you in the chest. The irony is that when Scowcroft was angry, he didn't stab people in the back. He became silent, which happened to an administrative assistant. He froze them out of decision-making, which happened to Dan Quayle in the vice president's office when it leaked information, or he fired them, which happened to one of his NSC staff members who leaked. The greater irony is that Scowcroft had many, many friends in Washington throughout the United States and around the world. And with his passing, and I'm sure you've seen, there have been numerous tributes for this highly respected, much-loved man, someone who's unanimously regarded as the most effective and best national security advisor in U.S. history since the position came into being formally in 1947. What I'd like to do this afternoon is really kind of a subset of what the title you heard from Joe, and that is to talk about the Scowcroft model, something that both John Bolton and current National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien endorsed. With Jake Sullivan soon to take office, someone whose approach echoes that of Brent Scowcroft, according to Robert Hormats, who worked under Scowcroft in the Ford and first Bush administrations, there's all the more reason to closely examine the Scowcroft model. Before John Bolton and O'Brien praised the Scowcroft model for the following qualities. First, quote, to provide the president with available options and the pluses and minuses of each, unquote, Bolton writes in the room where it happened. This is the honest broker role, that the National Security Advisor provide the president with his options faithfully and accurately, and in her or his presentation of those options, assess each honestly and impartially. Or, as the current National Security O'Brien said in the speech last year, the National Security Advisor should not advocate for one policy or another, but rather ensure that the president is well served by the cabinets, departments, and agencies in obtaining counsel and formulating his policies. All right, so that's one. A second is to ensure that White House decisions are carried out by the relevant bureaus. In Bolton's words, the NSC was the president's enforcer. I'll say more about this later. A third characteristic that they gave is to have the small National Security Council. We did not view it as necessary in this administration to recreate a mini State Department, a mini Pentagon, a mini Department of Homeland Security, O'Brien explained. Whereas there had been more than 200 on the NSC staff in the Obama administration, until Susan Rice cut it to fewer than 180 in early 17, O'Brien had a target of about 110 staff members, close to the number during the George W. Bush administration. So O'Brien had 40 to 45 staffers. People had been seconded from their departments and agencies, returned to their home organizations. Consistent with such vision, O'Brien commented, and another prong of the Scowcroft model, the National Security Council must be organized and staffed in order that it have the national security architecture capable of meeting the challenges ahead, whether this be confronting peacetime competition with China and Russia, addressing health threats from pandemics and bioterrorism, or stalling climate change. This organizational architecture, practically speaking, involves defining and staffing the operational desks, the policy areas that divide U.S. foreign affairs, and setting up the effective interagency process so that personnel with similar seniority and complementary expertise can meet up to hash out their policy differences and coordinate actions. These then are the attributes: honest brokerage, enforcing White House policy, reorganizing the SSC according to the dominant issues and priorities of the day, and streamlining its size, attributed to Scowcroft's examples from the Nixon, Ford, and Bush administrations. And I include the Nixon administrations because although the general did not officially become National Security Advisor until the Ford administration in November 75, he became acting National Security Advisor for all intents and purposes once Kissinger was appointed Secretary of State, in addition to his National Security Advisor role in September 73. Well, this isn't quite right if we think about the Scowcroft model. Certainly honest brokering, the fair and balanced presentations of options, as accurate, so the National Security Advisor to present the principal, say the Secretary of the Treasury, as if she herself were there, and Scowcroft was impeccable at representing the interests of a Secretary of State Kissinger, Treasury Secretary William Simon, Defense Secretary Dick Cheney, and other principals during the administrations in which he served. Now, as an aside, former National Security Advisor Bolton's own ability to uphold the standard is a separate matter we can discuss later. To turn to the second point, though, is assuredly not the job of the National Security Advisor to enforce the president's decisions. Rather, it is to get the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and other principals to buy into the president's decisions so that the principals abide by the decision and agree to execute them. This means assembling an expert and complementary foreign policy team during the presidential transition period, as George H.W. Bush and Scowcroft were able to do following the 1988 presidential election. And as Bolton points out, Donald Trump was unable to do following the 2016 election. So this setting up of a complementary staff means dialogue and persuasion so that the principals and their top aides are included in the foreign policy decision-making process and therefore want to cooperate in the making and carrying out the policy. Here then is where I would make a substitution to the Scowcroft model. Scowcroft and Bush saw that they assembled a team of top advisors who respected each other, believed in the policy processes they were setting up, and thereby mitigated the likelihood of leaks and back channel connections that might sabotage US policy. So it's not about enforcement as it's about securing voluntary cooperation from the relevant stakeholders in the making and implementing of decisions. Furthermore, all the principals in the George H.W. Bush White House trusted each other, making their jobs easier and even fun, in the words of Scowcroft's deputy, even irrespective of how much work was involved. But this is from the careful planning during the transition phase at Camp David and difficult meetings early on when things went wrong. In fact, the principals and their immediate aides trusted each other, but it was at the mid and lower levels where there were issues. So this is about getting the right people and figuring out the processes and hashing out their differences early on. In contrast, this is what former National Security Advisor Bolton writes in his memoir. Secretary of Defense Mattis was wrong tactically and strategically and looking for excuses. And Bolton describes UN Ambassador Haley as a free electron who did her own thing. And we could go on. This leads me to make an addition to the Scowcroft model, the trust that others in the administration had in him. They saw him as selfless and supported the presidency and the United States. Not only did he work very long hours, in contrast to his many predecessors and successors, but he worked almost ceaselessly during crises, whether the evacuation of South Vietnam, seizure of the Mayaguez, collapse and rescue of the British pound in late 76, the invasion of Panama, the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and subsequently the 1991 Gulf War. I should add another trait to the Scowcroft model, his proximity to the president. He was arguably closer to Presidents Ford and Bush 41 on foreign policy and the use of force than anyone else. This contrasts with several of the national security advisors under Presidents Reagan, Obama, and Trump. The Scowcroft model is also about parity in terms of the relationship between the national security advisor and the other chief principals, especially the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. So the National Security Advisor cannot be effective unless he or she is on a par with the others. So this contrasts with the poorly functioning and overmatched national security advisors during the Reagan administration and during the first George W. Bush term in office. To go to the original list from Bolton O'Brien, the Scowcroft model rightly involves adapting the interagency process to the areas of priority and to the specific personnel in state, defense, intelligence, and so forth. I should also, though, mention that the national security policymaking process depends on the president's own decision style. Did he prefer written memos or verbal briefings? Does he want to hear the recommendations of one or two of his most trusted aides, or does he want to participate in a full National Security Council meeting? Or is he happy delegating decisions to the Principals Committee, a Scowcroft invention, or other body, and then be advised accordingly? This is to say that in order to be effective, the National Security Advisor has to see to it that issues are presented and deliberated in ways that best match how the president's mind works. To proceed to the fourth quality on the list, O'Brien rightly points out that the place for the NSC is not to duplicate the research and recreate the expertise of the standing departments and agencies, but to aggregate information, coordinate decision-making, and ensure the smooth implementation of the president's policy. But some redundancy is necessary to provide a check on the biases and interests of the agencies and departments, given their own large budgetary and personnel stakes in U.S. national security policy. So what things are left out from these above qualities, including the ones I've added? Well, first is that the National Security Advisor owes the president her independent judgment. Not what he wants to hear, but what he needs to hear. This demands an iron will and a silk glove. The will to speak up on critical matters, and the diplomacy, political savvy, and judiciousness to know when and how to raise issues. With working for Kissinger, not a US president, of course, Scowcroft knew it was difficult to challenge him directly, so he'd ask him after raising a subject if he would like a memo on what was discussed. Kissinger would agree and then inevitably be persuaded by Scowcroft's memo. Another important, if underappreciated aspect of the job is overseeing relationships with the media and members of Congress. The president is not going to carry everyone along with his initiatives and decisions, of course, but if the National Security Advisor and the White House have good cases to make and are seen as credible, it is possible to get support for national security policy from both sides of the aisle. This means consulting regularly with key members of Congress, talking to members of the press, and delegating to other officials and social leaders. It is very important to communicate to all Americans, even if everyone cannot be persuaded. I read a good account in the Atlantic, I think it was, about why Obama changed his mind on intervening in Syria, his famous red line. And it made a lot of sense. It talked about allies and German support and some other factors, except this was never explained to the American public. By way of comparison, Scowcroft had a large role in overseeing the persuasion of others in Washington and the American public of the need to expel Iraq from Kuwait. Earlier, he personally, as chair of the MX Commission, persuaded members of Congress and the policy world of a solution to basing the new MX missile. A comparison of the US government's response to COVID-19 to the lone drives of World War II is instructive. And here, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from my dissertation and first book. The planning of the campaigns was done through the War Finance Division's Publicity and Promotion Division. Quote, this division is responsible for securing the cooperation of all publicity sources, for stimulating national advertising by radio, newspapers, magazines, billboards, and other media, for the designing of posters, albums, pamphlets, etc., used in promoting the sale of government securities. This division has 3 sections. The radio sections create special radio programs, edit radio scripts, and secures the cooperation of the radio networks. The newspaper section is charged with maintaining a service of news and advertising material to 1,700 daily newspapers and nearly 10,000 weekly newspapers, and also to maintain an active news desk to serve as a national wire service. And the magazine section operates on a basis similar to the newspaper section in the national magazine field. Basic publicities for the 6th War Loan Drive include sales manuals, a descriptive folder, a campaign book, an official 6th War Loan insignia, and stickers. Advertising was done through major outdoor promotions, radio, newspapers, magazines, posters, window streamers, trolley and bus flags, and matchbook covers. The war bond campaigns also depended on the cooperation of non-governmental actors. The Treasury worked closely with leading bankers, insurance men, company executives, brokers, women's groups, schools, colleges, universities, labor unions, and farmers associations. Specific organizations working closely with the War Finance Division included the National Federation of Sales Executives, the Industrial Advisory Committee, and the Advertising Council. War heroes, movie stars, popular entertainers, and sport figures agreed to appear at lunches, war plants, and other rallies. Among the celebrities participating in the campaign were Abbott and Costello, Fred Astaire, Ingrid Bergman, James Cagney, Bing Crosby, Betty Davis, Alfred Hitchcock, Carol Lombard, Ginger Rogers, Dick Powell, Basil Rathbone, and Barbara Stanwyck. The tours promoting the war loan drives featured presentations by war heroes, films, war bonds, symphony concerts, the display of captured enemy materiel, and an Army Air Force's show of airborne attack dubbed the Armada. Appeals were made to new parents. A bond grows with a baby, and bonds for a baby to give the babies we love a better chance and a better world, as well as to grandparents. The Grandmother's War Bond League was launched by Mrs. George C. Marshall under the slogan, "Grandmothers bond with the future, war bonds." I could go on. Remarkably, only 6% of Americans were not aware of the Sixth War Loan Drive from November through December 1944. So that's, again, is I think quite a stark contrast from what you saw nationally in response to the pandemic. This takes me to the last three additions to the Scowcroft model. What is crucial, and here Bolton and other national security advisors propose marked contrast, Scowcroft knew what he didn't know. This is even as he knew a great deal about military affairs, nuclear weapons, beltway politics, international commerce and finance, Washington bureaucracy, and the world history. Instead, he listened, asked good questions, and played the devil's advocate, wondering what could go wrong. He didn't have to prove he was the smartest man in the room or person in the room. Scowcroft had basic principles to which diplomacy, military planning, and diplomacy were tethered. My penultimate point. He was invariably and inevitably concerned with blood and treasure. I found from studying his action during the last years of Vietnam, the end of the Second World, and other developments in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, such as Tiananmen Square and the forced eviction of Iraqi troops from Kuwait. The blood is that of American lives, those of allies, and when possible, those of others. This also meant POWs and MIAs when he was Nixon's military assistant. Preserving lives means emphasizing diplomacy, using force judiciously, and if at all possible, rarely, and relying on covert actions when appropriate, and employing other measures and operations short of war. The treasure was about protecting and growing individual, corporate, and aggregate wealth. To prioritize wealth is to safeguard people's earnings and tax dollars. To protect individual and public wealth broadly considers land, buildings, infrastructure, livestock, and so forth. Conversely, protecting American treasure meant eschewing unnecessary expenses, such as spending on preventable or avoidable wars, and minimizing the repayment of debt by spending wisely and raising sufficient revenues for government outlays. He was an advocate of American commerce, the national economy, and indeed the world economy. He sought to fashion a stable, secure world, one receptive to American values and interests. Which brings me to my last point. He was about maintaining American hegemony. This has several implications. It means internal balancing of adjusting American military and economic priorities to reflect threats, whether terrorism or the rise of a competing superpower, as well as external balancing of coalition building and forming international alliances and using existing international organizations such as the WTO, IMF, and UN to make a world conducive to American interests and values. And it means diplomacy and the use of soft power globally. Phone calls, which Bush 41 did incessantly, dating back to his days as ambassador to the UN, diplomatic gardening, attending to international relations even when there's no agenda, and making gestures of respect, such as hosting and visiting other countries and attending funerals of foreign leaders. It also applies assertive action and farsighted vision, consistent with long-term American interests and with preserving blood and treasure. Scowcroft almost always considered the implications and consequences of actions. With respect to Vietnam then, as much as a supporter of the war, he observed that the United States had never thought through what it wanted and what its exit strategy might be. But the first Bush administration did think through what it wanted to do in response to Corby mania, how it would handle the fall of the Berlin Wall and German reunification, and how it would react to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. In sum, there are multiple aspects to Scowcroft's example of national security advisor. So it isn't possible to cherry pick particular dimensions such as honest brokering without considering others, such as the trust within the administration and for the National Security Advisor. Similarly, we can't think of the National Security Advisor as arranging the organizations and processes of national security policymaking without accounting for her or his relationship to the president and the principles and the principles and the priorities of the president. The Tiffany, the gold standard, if you will, of foreign policy interaction and deliberation and consensus building really was President George Herbert Walker Bush's administration, and that has to be credited to General Scowcroft. NBC News' Andrea Mitchell told me. And it would be foolish to think that 2, 3, or 4 attributes of Scowcroft's example as National Security Advisor by themselves can be plugged in and bring in success to another National Security Advisor in presidential administration. So let me stop there, and we can talk later on if there's time about the transition and the Biden team thus far. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks very much, Bat. I do have a question, but we can open up to anyone who wants to jump in.
Yeah, can I ask a question? Or do you want to go ahead? Would you talk a little bit about the decision to go to war in Iraq, against Iraq and Kuwait? There's a couple of books out that call it Mr. Bush's War, and another one calls it Bush's War. And I'd be just curious, your take on what the decision-making was leading up to that. In other words, deciding the sanctions would not ever work and essentially going to war and not even looking very deeply into the possibility of negotiating Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait.
Yeah, I know that there's kind of, it's, as most of these things are, it's overdetermined. I think there's, from what I've read, I think there's, certainly the first reaction, as you probably know, is that most in the White House, Bush himself was unpersuaded of the need for any kind of hard response. We also know that they were misinformed by Israeli, by Egyptian, and other foreign intelligence about the Iraqi troops and their the prospects for an invasion of Kuwait. We also, Bob Gates has said, I think it was, he told me, and I've seen this elsewhere in print, that no one in the administration thought that Saddam Hussein and Iraq would be so rash as to take all of Kuwait. They thought actually they would just take a little bit above the oil fields where it was said that Kuwait was doing this diagonal drilling. And if they took some, there was, I think, some toleration for that. But what happened is, I think once that it kind of caught them by surprise, and I think they thought about, well, what's going to happen? I think they were worried about the oil. I think they were worried about the example for the world in a post bipolar world. What kind of example this was setting? And I think, and you saw this with their reactions to Baker's negotiations at the almost the nth hour, that there was already, I think, a predisposition, or I think they were not wary or reluctant to go to war. So I think there was, and I'm not sure what the root of that is, but there certainly seems to be an appetite for war, given these other factors that I explained. And what is behind that, I'm not sure.
Was that wide, or is that just Bush in particular? There are a number of people that talked to Bush, including a friend of mine, who said, I talked to a congressman, he said, my God, he wants to go to war. And the question is, was that Scowcroft's position, whatever? My question is not about the opposition to Kuwait, to the invasion of Kuwait. That was universal. But the Democrats in particular were saying, no, we shouldn't go to war. We should have.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's also the option of some sort of negotiation, which of course Bush repeatedly refused to even consider. And I just wonder how deep that was within the administration, if it really was Bush's war, in other words, or was.
I would say, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, just the issue. Was it Bush's war? Is that a fair characterization of it? Or was it, I mean, he obviously brought people along, and obviously the president had to agree to have the war at all. But the issue would be, he seemed to have been the driving force. It was a personal, a lot of people argue at any rate, is really very much a personal sort of thing with him and his hatred of Saddam, also in Noriega earlier in Panama. But anyway, I'm just curious about what the mix was, what was going on, what kind of debates there were. Obviously, Colin Powell was on the reluctant side. And so I don't know where Scowcroft was and all that. And it was just following Bush, or were they pushing Bush or whatever?
No, my sense is what I read and looking at it fairly closely is that we know that Richard Haas was in support, and I think Eagleburger was support, but really that Scowcroft was the main engine because he was closest to the president. And at first, the president was hearing one thing from the Secretary of State and from Powell and others. I think Cheney and others were on the fence. And after an initial NSC meeting following the invasion, which was sort of inconclusive, they were about to go out to Aspen to meet with Margaret Thatcher. And in that period, immediately after the initial NSC meeting, before the second one, after they got back, Scowcroft persuaded Bush and got the rest of really pretty much most of the rest of the cabinet on board that they need to resist this for the multiple reasons I suggested earlier. So I think there was this, and in fact, several people have said, well, really, it was Scowcroft who, I mean, although Scowcroft gave credit to President Bush, Bush gives credit to Scowcroft, and so do others who were sort of witnessed the White House up close. And so my sense is that it was really Scowcroft, but then he shortly persuaded Bush, and then the rest kind of went along with him.
Bat, I'd like to pick up with a question on the theme of Iraq that John brought up, except more in relation to 2003. Obviously, after Scowcroft retired or left government in 1993, he had a lot of sway and gravitas as kind of a don of national security issues, right? And however, when you look at his commentary on Iraq, especially kind of the famous Wall Street Journal op-ed he wrote in 2002, "You don't attack Saddam," all of it was very, very couched, right? Very qualified. I can't really find any statements where he says, "Don't do this. This is a bad idea. This is going to be a disaster," which seems to be his underlying opinion. Although I don't know if that's true. Maybe you can comment on that. But my bigger question is about this role of honest broker, right? Or the role of a national security official, especially a prominent one, after they retire. And what seemed to be the norm, at least that Scowcroft had absorbed, was you don't take a super hard position, especially against, the relative of or the son of your close friend, close associate. So I wonder if you can kind of comment on that norm, whether you think that's still a norm, right? Whether that road has been eroded in the last 4 years or since the end of the Cold War. And what do you think there's value to that norm, or whether it should be transcended?
So about the norm, I think, I think that, I mean, you said you read the books, you probably recall this, but it was really a sort of a last resort by Scowcroft, right? That he goes on television the week before, says the same thing. There's no response. Condoleezza Rice doesn't reach out to him. Nobody else in the administration does. I think they thought this kind of harping voice would go away. It doesn't. And he and who was, I'm blanking on the name, anyway, who was with him on the Scowcroft group, both thought, well, why don't we do an op-ed? Because they thought this was an utter disaster and it needed to be very clear. But you're quite right to point out that if you read that op-ed carefully, he kind of equivocates, right? He says, if you don't do this, if you don't do that, then this may do this. And so it's all very nicely couched, but I think you're quite right. He was respectful of the son of his very good friend and someone who he himself knew well, George W. Bush. And but he did want to feature this in the Wall Street Journal, and that, the op-ed page is regarded kind of as the bulletin board of the Republican Party. So he thought, well, this is really a very, very important message and I need to get this out. Having said that, well, what about the norm? I think it was, if I think if he felt that those discussions were being held in the White House, he wouldn't have done it, but they weren't being discussed. I mean, I kind of show this, at least from my research, that there was never a kind of comprehensive discussion about, well, do we go to war against Iraq in after 9/11, and what is our objective? Rather, it was kind of assumed early on. In fact, even before the 9/11 attack, there was talk, and as we know in the Clinton administration, there was that resolution that went through both houses about responding to Saddam Hussein. So this is something where I think they were spoiling for an occasion to go to war against Iraq and really hadn't thought it through. And of course, for them to go ahead and do this without any kind of plan about what's going to happen, what's going to be the end game, what's going to replace that that order in Iraq, that internal order, he thought was foolhardy. And plus, of course, the point about an international coalition and going it alone. So about the norm, I mean, maybe some of you in the audience have seen more, but I haven't seen really very much of people speaking out against. I mean, you'll see a few things maybe here and there about the current administration, at least early on, and some of its actions. I think particularly with respect to Iran and the Iran nuclear agreement. But I don't see a whole lot of that. So I think there is. I mean, you see this, I think, with the president himself, that they're kind of loath to speak out critically of their predecessors, and that I think their top aides, by and large, follow that norm. And I think there's certainly plenty in the Washington community who can speak out. And so if you really care about something, you can, go through the White House if you know people, or certainly have surrogates make your case. So that seems possible. Let me leave it there.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question, but I want to see if anyone else wants to jump in, either on the question of Iraq and this norm that we talked about, or any other question. Okay, well, I'll follow up then. Okay. My follow-up is just kind of push forward on the normative side of the norm a little bit. The obvious purpose of this norm would seem to be elite protection, or elites protecting elites. Is there another purpose that's worth, I mean, right now we're in a historical moment that is seeing the erosion of so many norms. I think the question is this one that's worth protecting? The somewhat hands-off approach that elite foreign policymakers take towards current foreign policymakers, or is that one that should go out with the many other norms that have been taken out recently?
No, I think that's an excellent point. In fact, throughout my career as a political scientist, I've been struck by how often policymakers make heinous decisions, or maybe that's too strong, but make, I think, very bad decisions, or actually even do things that are legal. And as long as they have enough money or had a sufficiently high office, they're quickly welcomed back into the fold. And so I think there are probably insufficient reputational effects from what people are doing as representatives or agents of the public trust when they're in presidential administrations or serving on behalf of the president. So I would like to see this norm, this kind of protections of elites. I mean, at one point, Scowcroft tells Bolton, we need people like you to, protect us. And, and they agree on disagree about just about everything. And I think if he were ever going to be so catty, he would probably, not at all be agreeing with most of Bolton's policies and indeed is kind of his behavior. But there is, I think, certainly with him and a lot of people, there is this long-term, I think, elite protection. I think that's a good way to see it, because I really haven't kind of thought about it explicitly. I've just noticed this phenomenon of this protection of people. I mean, there's a huge Wall Street guy who still, I think, runs a hedge fund or an investment bank, and he's kind of did some pretty bad things in the 70s, and this kind of goes on and no one talks about it, and this stuff keeps on.
Yeah, could you expand a little bit on that? The issue about people who have been wrong not being punished for it. In the case of Obama, he was against the war in Iraq. And as far as I know, he appointed nobody to Foreign Policy Office that was against the war in Iraq. They're all in favor of it. And Biden seems to be doing the same thing. So the fact that you're consistently wrong In fact, in that case, disastrously wrong, albeit possibly with good reason. That doesn't seem to disqualify you in the slightest. You keep bouncing back. Is that a general phenomenon? I mean, failure doesn't failure in leading people into a disaster, which has killed hundreds of thousands of people, doesn't cause your reputation to be hurt, I guess.
Yeah, I think this gets into some of Andrew Bastovich's criticisms, and kind of people talk about the blob and
Right.
foreign policy established and so forth. So I think there's certainly an element of that. You do want the expertise. Now, I mean, part of that is on your point, and something I was going to mention is the transition. Is it looks like the folks that Biden is appointing are saying the right things about speaking truth to power and about being outspoken. And Sullivan looks like he's very, very able and doesn't have a huge ego and very expert. At the same time, these nominees, the Secretary of State and the DNI and now Security Advisor, and I'm sure others, were part of either Biden's office or the Obama White House that arguably mishandled Syria, and or more than arguably mishandled Syria and Libya, and really didn't do anything of note in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and made other missteps. And so yes, there is. Now we'll see. They weren't the architects of those decisions either, and so perhaps they've learned, and perhaps this. I think there's a good chance that they are able to function as an effective team because they know each other, and Sullivan and Blinken are good friends, and so I think this bodes well. But we'll see kind of how nimble they are, and of course the Secretary of Defense is a huge role, and to sort of see if. And I'm not sure, in other words, to go back to your question or comment, if there are any people who kind of think from first principles or sort of think in any way that kind of challenges the kind of established order, or willing to rock the boat in any way, and we'll see, because certainly there are a lot of things that need change and reorganization.
Well, there might be a parallel.
Oh, sorry, John, we have a question.
Let me just mention this quick.
Yep.
With a parallel with the war in Libya, which proved to be a disaster. I think both Blinken and Sullivan were gung-ho about that, although Biden was opposed to it. So it's similar with Obama, who had actually opposed the Iraq war, appointing nobody that had appointed it. Maybe the same thing will happen with Biden, same way.
Yeah.
But, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, thank you. No, it's okay. Rick Herman has a question, and then if anyone else has a question or comment, just feel free to jump in or send me a chat message. Rick?
Yeah, thank you very much for the interesting talk. I wonder if the Scowcroft model, as you've been calling it, is very generalizable. If I recall, he comes in to be the National Security Director advisor just after the Tower Commission comes out. And he, of course, was a member of that commission and had a big hand in it. And of course, it's a response to Iran-Contra and an out of control, so to speak, NSC. And I was on Baker's policy planning staff. So as I was entering into that staff, I remember talking to Dennis Ross, who told me, don't go to the NSC, go to policy planning, because Baker's going to run foreign policy. And the NSC was cut from somewhere around 300 people to maybe 80. I know it's ballooned way back up now. I think now it's over 500 again. But in the Scowcroft era, it was fewer than 100 people, at least at the beginning of Bush 1. And we had point over at Baker's shop on lots of stuff until the Iraq War began, and the Kuwait War in any case. And so I wonder, there must have been a decision on Bush 1's part to have a very small NSC. He was able to maintain that for a while, and you're coming on the heels of Iran-Contra. And it hasn't been able to be sustained. The NSC now, again, is a very big organization. And it seems that most presidents want that. And Scowcroft was there at a moment when the president did not want that. And so I wonder whether, I'm just interested in process, not content so much here, whether it comes at a unique moment because of the Tower Commission and the history just before it.
But I think there's something to that. I think there's also kind of the evolution of, as the world gets more complex and as the military and intelligence communities grow, that they realize that there needs to be some more interagency process. There needs to be a larger kind of core group or set of expert personnel in the White House to reconcile and to bridge these different areas, to match diplomacy with military and economic policy and with legal counsel, and you name it. So I think there's one thing. There's this kind of this but you're right, it undulates, right? It's not a smooth curve going from the Eisenhower, Kennedy up to President Trump. I'm not sure if you joined late, but I mentioned that it was kind of over 200 with Obama, and that's the listed people. So in effect, it may have been more than that, as you suggest. But now I saw something that it's down to 105, and I couldn't get current numbers, but that's certainly O'Brien said he wanted to get it down, and they just sent people back to their home organizations, as I was saying. So I think there is now. I think there are a couple things. One is that I think it's important to have a kind of a center of gravity in the White House because of the fact that you have these independent, or not independent, but these tremendously powerful bureaucracies of the Pentagon and also, depending on the president, the State Department, as you suggest, and intelligence and sometimes Treasury, depending on the president, and other parts of the government. And so they are going to have their vested interests in budgets and certain axes or preferences that they have. And so I think it's important to have a little bit of redundancy in the White House. So you need its own experts. At the same time, you need to have the people to coordinate. And I agree with O'Brien that you don't want to have you don't want to duplicate all the research, and you don't want to duplicate all of the analysis and all the things that the State Department is doing and the Pentagon is doing and so forth. But you do need to have this coordinated. And so I would think it might have to be larger than 60 or 80 as it was under the first Bush and Scowcroft. But I don't see that you'd want to have the multiple hundreds that you did under Obama. So I think there's some balance there. But I would stress this point about both. It's about it's a matrix organization. You want to have the coordination and the making of policy and the coordination of policy and the follow through of policy, and you really to let the State Department and military do its own thing as long as it's coordinated and in sync with the other crucial parts of government.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Earlier you mentioned that you wanted to talk about Biden nominees. Do you feel like you got a chance to talk about that adequately?
Yeah, I did a little bit. Let me just say one thing more. Is this? I think it was brought up by John Mueller about the differences of Biden was against the first Gulf War. He supported the use of ground troops in the former Yugoslavia. He sought NATO enlargement. He backed the 2003 invasion of Iraq, to his later regret, and he opposed the 2007 troop surge. So all opposed to what Scowcroft's recommendations were. Now we can, go back and forth on any of these, but I would agree mostly with Scowcroft, especially with the advantages of hindsight. And so this is all to say that, even if Biden was twice chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and co-chair of the NATO Observer Group in the Senate, he definitely needs people who are willing, and he has to be willing to listen. And I don't think he has strong foreign policy instincts or training or knowledge in a way that, say, Nixon or the first Bush did. And so absent that, I think it's very important then that he have good advisors, and whether they have the kind of the right instincts and they make, wise decisions, we'll see. But ultimately, as I said, I think this is about the longer term interests of very simply, kind of U.S. blood and treasure, but that redounds to the rest of the world as well.
I have a second question. I wonder if the role of the National Security Advisor has been diminished in the last, I don't know, 15 or 20 years. I mean, we haven't seen another Kissinger or even a Brzezinski in a very long time. It seems that even now, for instance, when I think about anyone in the current administration beyond Trump who seems to have any say over foreign policy, it seems to be Pompeo. And you can't even remember the names of the national security advisors. They change so often, they seem so inconsequential. But Pompeo doesn't. Pompeo seems to be a real player in this political environment. And as I think back in the Obama years, I also wonder, we all knew who the Secretary of State was all the time, whether it was Clinton or Kerry. These were very prominent people. And the national security advisors kind of were often not household names, they weren't known by many of anybody. And that's a big change from when, in Kissinger's day, he was much more famous than Secretary Rogers. And so I'm just curious, over time, as you watch this, is there a diminution of the prominence of the national security advisor as a major player in policy formulation?
Well, I think it really depends on well, I don't think it depends. It's a weak answer. I would say that, in fact, the Brzezinski model and the Kissinger model are precisely the ones not to follow. Is that you want someone like Donilon, who was Obama's, I guess, second national security advisor, who's now being thought of as a possibility for the head of the CIA, or someone like what's his name thinking of Stephen Hadley in the second George W. Bush term. You want people who are very effective, very knowledgeable, but I think like Scowcroft behind the scenes, because it is about coordination, and these people are not approved by the Senate. And so this was Scowcroft's conception of the office, that it's not operational and it's kind of more behind the scenes, consistent with what he wrote in his parts of the Iran-Contra findings, the study of the Iran-Contra, the report. And so I think that it's that actually the Brzezinskis who are outspoken and Kissinger's who are getting attention. I mean, they actually ran, certainly Kissinger concentrated power away from the State Department and away from the defense and others. And it was really kind of he and Nixon, which really didn't work out all that well. I mean, yes, we have success on arguably success perhaps with opening to China, but in terms of the Vietnam War, in terms of other policies around the world, I would say that you lost a lot of important voices, and the result of this was a lot of backstabbing and leaking of information in those administrations. So I think actually you want someone who's quite powerful and close to the president, but also someone who says, look, I am not a public official in the way the Secretary of State is, or the Secretary of Defense, or other top officials. And it's right that I play a subordinate role, but it doesn't mean that a Hadley or a Donilon or perhaps even a Sullivan aren't as important as anybody else in the foreign policy sphere. And in fact, I'd go farther and say that, Brzezinski and Kissinger, both wrote a great deal after their times in office, and Brzezinski was, very, very outspoken, but, there was a lot of problems with Vance, and afterwards, a lot of his ideas. I mean, I was looking at Scowcroft wrote over 100 op-eds over the course of his career. The only people who exceeded him as far as policy voices were Kissinger and Brzezinski. But a lot of this, of course, was after they had left office, and most of the times they weren't really effective or had advice that was followed. So they were kind of they wrote a lot, but they weren't always the most effective folks.
I don't disagree, but I do think Marshall Schulman was one of my mentors. And of course, he had enormous frustrations. He was with Vance at State, and on many Russian issues, Brzezinski ended up winning the day, as frustrating as that was to Schulman. And so I think Brzezinski had more than just after the fact credit claiming. I think he often had a big influence over policy.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
Mitch, are you looking to jump in?
Yeah, it's a much more narrow question, Bat, and changing the subject a little bit. So I'll just ask you to be real quick. But I wondered if you'd comment on Scowcroft and the North Korean situation. In my own work, I've seen him in the early Bush years being pretty supportive of the withdrawal of American nukes from South Korea and some of the early peace overtures in that time period. But then he's pretty hawkish later on. And just wondering if you'd comment on just sort of his views and maybe particularly what he might think of the Trump administration's efforts over the last few years.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't answer about North Korea with respect to a specific positions, just because I kind of had to economize a bit, and I couldn't cover everything. So I don't really talk about Vietnam or Cambodia or Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War. I don't talk very much about Central and Latin America, and so just very little about Japan, because Japan really wasn't a security problem or issue, although there was obviously all that business with trade and worried about Japanese culture and Japanese, buying American property and so forth. So I don't really talk and know really very much about what his position was on North Korea. About how he would react now, I think certainly be in favor of having an open channel with North Korea and negotiating, or maybe not negotiating this long term, but certainly talking about, well, how can we do things to obviate the need for nuclear weapons? What can we do? And let's make this work, because we don't want this. And is there a combination of sanctions and incentives that will? So I think that generally the engagement and negotiation would, although I said I wasn't going to use that term, I think that's appropriate, and he would approve that. In fact, this is where I think Scowcroft, one of his examples that I didn't mention, is just keeping these doors open to other governments and other heads of state, or even people at lower levels than the head of state, because you never know when you'll need them or when something will come up. Or it's like, it's like bad neighbors. You have to live with them. It's kind of a silly example, but this is our world, and I think he would be very practical about this. We may, dislike the current leadership in Turkey or Egypt or wherever it is, but we need to maintain a dialogue, even if assuming we can be clear about where we stand, and aren't doing anything to endorse something we find despotic or reprehensible in whatever way. But I think he certainly would want to keep open channels. And so in this sense now, how I think in retrospect, and maybe your question gets at this, Mitch, it seems like that the Trump was kind of hornswoggled and taken advantage of, and a little bit more than a little bit naive here. So obviously he would disagree with that and want more input from the State Department and from intelligence and people who really knew the situation in Korea better.
Right now we've got about 5 minutes left, which is room for, I think, one more question. So I wonder if anyone wants to jump in with one last question. If not, I will take that last question. This was kind of alluded to in the last comment. And earlier you mentioned Andrew Bacevich, and I think that one of the most important conversations right now in the field of the study of grand strategy is the question of liberal hegemony, right? That the Walton, Bacevich, and others have argued the United States has pursued that quite disastrously since into the Cold War. Those kind of arguments usually or often leave off the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. They often leave Scowcroft and Bush out of that. And you mentioned earlier that one of Scowcroft's priorities as National Security Advisor was to preserve American hegemony. I don't dispute that at all. My question is, to what extent do you think he wanted a liberal hegemony specifically? And if he didn't, does that make him sort of an outlier in the post-Cold War foreign policy world?
Yeah, I think he's a bit of an outlier. He's called himself an enlightened realist. So he's kind of a realist. He studied Morgenthau. He worked obviously very closely with Kissinger, and he was kind of came of age during the onset and deepening of the Cold War. So he was very much a Cold Warrior and believed, as I said, I talked about sort of balancing in American hegemony. Having said that, he believed that there were obvious advantages of cost reduction, of force multiplication, all sorts of advantages of international cooperation, of international organizations, of using them in ways that help the United States and frankly, I think the West and other, I mean, he's, at the end of the day, I came to see Scowcroft as someone who, not too far from, you guys can maybe know who the quote is, what's good for GM is good for America. But the idea that sort of corporate America was America or a crucial component of it. So I think he is kind of this reflects his clients once he goes to the Scowcroft group and sort of founds it in 1994. He founds it actually earlier in 93, but it then becomes the Scowcroft group. And so where he works with the largest American firms to promote them and their access and solve problems of licensing or joint venturing and so forth around the world. So I think that's true. But having said that, I think I talked about American Blood and Treasure and one of the people, I think he was also very open to and I saw as important about international norms and beliefs and I guess some liberal beliefs, certainly in human freedoms. I mean, he wouldn't talk about freedoms, but he talked about human dignity, which is maybe a little bit easier. So not necessarily automatic human rights, because he would think that, well, human rights are ultimately, whether we like it or not, going to be determined by a government, such as whether it's a Chinese government or a Russian government or other government. So I don't think he was, so he wasn't sort of an international liberal in that sense of a human rights proponent, but he did, I mean, you could argue that, and I've argued at one point, is that what he did though, is to reduce the arms in Central Europe and to peaceably work very strongly with Baker and Bush to end peaceably the Cold War, that this actually did more for human rights and the avoidance of bloodshed and hardship than if he had been more demanding, aka Reagan at an earlier age, when he says, tear down this wall. I mean, he was about kind of respecting the existing leaders, existing heads of state. And so in this sense, he's kind of a realist, accepting the world, and then as much as possible, smuggle in or have ways to expand through, possibly incentives, possibly supporting other governments or other parties, you name it, because he was, as I said, a realist willing to use covert action or other means, allies, to promote democratic values and kind of market economics. But I think first and foremost, he was about stability. And I think he saw stability as being in the best interest. And so in this sense, and I can't pretend to be an expert at international liberalism, but I would think that he falls a little short of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Bat, for a great talk. We were kind of now hit the end of the hour, but I really appreciate you coming to join us and talking about this excellent book. And hopefully we can stay connected in the future. For everyone else, I just want to say really quickly, this is the last cluster event of the semester, but we will have our next cluster discussion group on January 21st from 4 to 5. Our speaker is going to be Jeff Trimble of the Political Science Department here at Ohio State. He's going to discuss U.S. international media in the age of disinformation. Bat, thank you again. We really appreciate it, and I hope you have a great holiday season.